My name is David Dodds, and I am the Communication Director at the University of North Dakota. I am joined today on the panel by UND President Andrew Armacost, who will lead the university's responses today. He is joined on the panel by Nathan Davis, Executive Director of the North Dakota Indian Affairs Commission, and UND Professor Doug McDonald and Lane Lyons, both of whom are members of our UND Repatriation Committee. Just a quick note that we are recording the press conference so it can be shared afterward. Before we get to media questions, I would first like to turn it over to opening remarks from our panelists. President Armacost.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Armacost, and I'm the president of the University of North Dakota. As Dave Dodds just mentioned, I'm joined by Lane Lyons, Doug McDonald, and Nathan Davis, and I appreciate their contributions to the information that we're going to share today. I must begin my remarks by offering my respect to Native American communities and Indigenous people throughout North America. The information I'm sharing today must begin with my apologies to them, and also to stress our commitment to the work that I'm about to describe and see it through until its very end. Work began at UND last November to develop campus policies on the process of returning Native American artifacts to tribal lands. This is a process known as repatriation. We began with the formation of a committee which comprised both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members. I'm extraordinarily proud of the work that this committee has done over many months. And in a moment, you will hear a firsthand account of one committee member, Lane Lyons. In late February, members of the committee began searching for a missing sacred item on our campus. That search led to the discovery of a significant number of artifacts, most notably ancestral remains, which by culture and custom are known to be ancestors. Even a single bone or a bone fragment from a human being is known to be an ancestor. Since that discovery, we have been working with representatives from tribes in the region to seek their advice and their counsel, and to begin the early steps in the process of repatriation. We reached out by phone and in person. Their recent visit to our campus included blessing of spaces where ancestors and sacred items were stored, and the single location where the arduous work of developing a complete understanding of what we have here at UND will happen. The response of each tribal representative has been common: anger, sadness, acceptance of our apologies, and appreciation that we are involving them from the outset of this work. We will continue this spirit of partnership throughout our repatriation activities. We hope that this model of tribal partnership and involvement at the very beginning of repatriation can serve as a model for other universities and museums across North America. This work will attempt to connect ancestors and artifacts with their place of origin, and we will hire the appropriate experts to support us. When this is complete, the ancestors and sacred items will be returned in a manner consistent with the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA, involving federal agencies, state agencies, and most importantly, the tribal nations themselves. The number of ancestors that we have here currently on campus can be measured in the dozens. When we include other sacred artifacts, we have well over 250 boxes. Please know that our records for the ancestors and items in our possession are incomplete, and our work will connect them to the sites from where they were taken. Our initial impression is that some of the ancestors and funerary items were taken directly from sacred burial mounds, These excavations took place over the course of decades, from the 1940s and into the 1980s. We believe that repatriation activities did previously happen at UND, but how and why ancestors and sacred items remain on our campus is a mystery that we will have to answer in the course of our work. Our intent of sharing this news today is to apologize to tribal nations across North America, to avoid speculation about what's been happening on campus, and to offer our public commitment to those tribal nations and to the entire nation that we're going to return the ancestors and the artifacts to their homes. I have offered this commitment in the strongest possible terms to the council chairs of tribes associated with the state of North Dakota. The awareness of this work will allow us to have open conversations with the students, faculty, and staff at the University of North Dakota about the importance of repatriation and our commitment to see it through. Yesterday, we held 2 open sessions for our American Indian campus members. The first was with faculty and staff. The second was with students. Please know that this is an extraordinarily traumatic time for them. And we have resources on our campus and in place to support them as they struggle with this news. We will continue to partner with all tribes connected to these ancestors and sacred items. Undoubtedly, our connections will continue to grow as we learn more. And finally, let me touch on the issue of accountability. Our top priority currently is the return of ancestors and sacred items home to their tribal lands. Our knowledge of how this happened must include discussions with people involved in UND's archaeological research efforts in prior decades. Their accounts will be important as we piece together why this repatriation did not happen sooner, and also to address systemic issues at the university that led to where we are today. Please let me now introduce Lane Lyons to come forward for her comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lane Lyons. I am an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians located in Belcourt, North Dakota. I'm a director of development for the College of Arts and Sciences here at UND, and I'm also an alumni 2016 of the College of Arts and Sciences as well. Today, I'll be speaking on behalf of the NAGPRA Compliance Committee. This committee includes Doug McDonald, Keith Malater, Daniel Henry, Allison Kelleher, Donald Warren, Kyle Hill, Crystal Alberts, William Caraher, Sarah Heitkamp, Birgit Hans, Elizabeth Sharp, Kurt Hansen, Heather Wages, and myself. With their permission, I'll be speaking on the repatriation process we have started here at the University of North Dakota. On November 18th, 2021, I met Crystal Alberts to look at a collection that included headdresses or war bonnets, traditional dresses, moccasins, and other sacred items. These items were brought into a question through a partnership with a tribal entity. After establishing the wear and tear of these items, we began working on policies and taking a deeper dive into what UND had or owned, since it seemed that no one really knew what we had or how we got them. Fast forward to March 3rd, 2022. Sarah Heitkamp and her assistant and Crystal Alberts came across a ceremonial pipe in a space while documenting what they thought was anthropological artifacts. After stopping the documentation, Crystal called me to assist with cultural protocols. At that time, I didn't feel comfortable doing it by myself, so I made a phone call to Dr. Don Warren and Dr. Allison Kelleher to help assist as well. After our cultural protocols took place, we decided to take a look at another space. Between 12:30 and 1:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, Don Warren, Allison Kelleher, Crystal Alberts, and myself discovered the first ancestor Dr. Warren identified the box that contained the ancestor. I will never forget the look on his face, as it was the face of disappointment. In that moment, my heart sunk into my stomach. It was at that moment that I knew we were another institution that didn't do the right thing. Following the discovery, we informed other committee members at that time of the tragic news. Their hearts sunk to their stomachs as well. They felt betrayed, angry, sad, frustrated, and exhausted. All feelings and emotions that happen when grieving. I will never forget the look on their faces and the sound of their voices as well. During that same time, we informed the university administration of our findings. The same feelings were felt and expressed. It begs the questions: how did this happen? Who did this? Why did they do this? All questions we are seeking to know and looking to answer. As we move forward, President Armacost and myself and others started having individual conversations with tribal representatives and state and federal agencies to discuss our findings. All who we spoke with were shocked, upset, angry, and devastated. Personally, these conversations were extremely difficult for me. They made me relive March 3rd every day, over and over. As we continued to search other areas, more and more ancestors began to be discovered. Each new one that was found felt like a deeper and deeper cut in their hearts. I want to make this clear. Through this process, it was important to our committee that we be transparent and open with our Indigenous communities. We have a strong and resilient Indigenous community amongst UND, students, staff, faculty, and alumni. We felt it was important to involve tribal representatives in the process instead of notifying them at the very end. We felt it was important to do this process in the most respectful way possible. The conversations I had just mentioned, although there was hurt, sadness, and anger, there was also appreciation. They appreciated the way that we were handling this and expressed that this was not the norm when dealing with situations like this. As we continue through this long and emotional work, we will continue to do this with the most respectful way possible. Being transparent, honest, and respectful will continue to guide this university. The committee, including myself, is proud of the work that we've done and the approach that we have taken. The representation of the committee and the guidance we have received is the reason we have done this process in a different way, and that's a good way. If there's any advice we could give on behalf of the committee, it would be for all institutions to look at their history and what they may have due to that history. This is a painful process for our Indigenous communities. But what is even more painful is to ignore or just pass off what you know or what you might find. In closing, I just would like to say that we are so grateful for the help, guidance, and trust that we have been given by so many. At this start of the process, we felt anger, hurt, sadness. However, we can now feel a sense of relief and hope because our ancestors will be returned to their rightful place, and that's home. We'll make sure of that. Thank you.
Alcohol washtelo na bujuniji michaje chetengleshka. I greet you in the language of my family of the Oglala Lakota people. Say hello to good friends and give my name, which was given to me when I was discharged from the U.S. Navy Spotted Hawk. I've been a professor at this university for going on 31 years now in the Department of Psychology and the director of the Indians into Psychology program. I arrived on this campus in the midst of the whole Fighting Sioux and Logo situation, which even at that time, after 1992, certainly drug on for years. And I don't have to remind any that were here or that were even just remotely aware of that experience, that it left scars with relatives on both sides of the issue, and certainly in and amongst the UND American Indian community. I can speak with assurance that this has been harder, been tougher. I was also here in 1997 during the flood and directed the disaster mental health response during that time. And I remember something that one of the Red Cross mental health responders told me. She was very experienced, and she said, "Doug, a flood is different than any other type of natural disaster in the sense that it doesn't just happen immediately and then you start to deal with the aftermath." She said, it's a slow moving disaster. And those words have come back to me ever since I was notified of the situation with the ancestors back in February. This is a slow moving disaster for many of us, certainly those of us that are tasked with dealing with it. And for those of us that are tasked with dealing with it, those of us that have agreed to assume the responsibilities necessary, I'd like everyone to understand that none of us have been trained or are fully competent to do this work. I'm a psychologist, and albeit an American Indian psychologist, and that is my area of expertise that I bring to the committee. But there's no one on the committee that signed up for this by any means. And there's no one on this committee that knew anything about this. We're doing our best by all means. And when I say best, we've had to constantly remind ourselves throughout that as soon as we became aware of as many of the variables that we could, that there was no right way or no good way to make the many different decisions that we've had to make. Many times the decisions that we've arrived upon, and they haven't always been fully consensual or happy necessarily, have been to settle on the least bad decision because they all hurt. I'm sure that anyone listening to this, whether you be of American Indian or Indigenous heritage or not, can at least appreciate the pain and the anguish associated with becoming aware of the circumstances. For those of us on the committee that are of American Indian descent, I know I can speak for Commissioner Davis as well, that we are all Northern Plains American Indian tribal members. And when we became aware of the locations, and those of which we know, from which the ancestors came from, you suddenly begin to realize, knowing where your own family and tribes came from, that it's highly likely that those are your ancestors. And like I said, that's hard. It's been hard to maintain the confidentiality, and I'm trained to maintain confidentiality as a psychologist, and it's been excruciating to be only able after all these months to be able to share it with you. So I hope folks will appreciate that. As I touched on earlier, my primary responsibility to the committee is to lend a mental health response similar to this new flood that we're facing in terms of disaster mental health response. And those details are certainly available on our website. And our primary concern has been our American Indian students and their families and allies, as well as certainly our American Indian faculty, staff, and families and allies, by all means. And I will end with that and thank everyone for their concern and pray for our continued healing, because there's still a lot of work to do to bring the ancestors home.
As you heard previously from President Armacost, my name is Nathan Davis, and I serve currently as the Executive Director of Indian Affairs here in the state of North Dakota. I'm an enrolled member that was born and raised in the Turtle Mountains. My mother's family is Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and my father's family is Minwakanawiate from the Spirit Lake Nation. Receiving this news about our ancestors, I can imagine, is not easy for anyone that's listening, anyone that has been having these conversations the last few days. It wasn't easy for me, nor was it something I ever expected to come across my desk with the position that I currently hold. And I will say what hit me really hard was, as a Native man, our job is to protect the younger generations, our life givers, and to bestow them teachings that will carry them into the future. And along with that, our job is to protect our teachings, to protect our Gitche Anishinaabe, our elders, and to honor our ancestors and protect them as well. My initial reaction, as you heard, was very similar to a lot of the other relatives that have heard this news recently. First, it was shock, it was disbelief. And I want to say, those that know me will probably understand this. It was the first time in my life that I was speechless. That's not something that really ever happens to me. But that feeling of shock and disbelief soon gave way to confusion and to anger. And in the teachings that I received in my life from my elders, from my ancestors, all I could do was go home and pray. I prayed for our ancestors, and I hoped that they would find peace in this process, as that was the first I've heard of it. And I will say that in our way, in our culture, in anything that I was taught, when one of our loved ones passes on, they are mourned over, they are prayed over, and there is a ceremony for them to begin their journey. And once we put them in the ground and they become one with our mother, that is where they are to stay. There's nothing that I've ever been taught as a Native American man to put my relatives back in the ground. It violates who we are. It violates our culture. So when we say this hurts, it's because it touches our soul, it touches our spirit. Because in our ways, this is not supposed to happen. Our loved ones are supposed to rest. Immediately following my initial visit with President Armacost and Ms. Lyons, I had to take a few moments to get myself together. And I will say that in my position, being afforded the luxury of letting my personal feelings come to the surface is not something that happens regularly. No matter what happens, we have a job to do. I have a duty to carry out on behalf of my people and on behalf of the state of North Dakota. So I immediately scheduled a follow-up meeting with Governor Burgum. And immediately following those conversations, I facilitated yet another follow-up meeting that included President Armacost and Ms. Lyons. And I will say, through those conversations, my direct boss, which would be Governor Burgum, was very fired up. He takes tribal engagement to the utmost importance, and he understands the need for mutual respect and understanding with our tribal partners in which we share geography with. But following those meetings, we had private conversations. And I will say that he allowed me to be open. He allowed me to be honest. And I will say that I was not only speaking with a boss at that moment, but a friend. And per those conversations, he understood that as the state of North Dakota, we needed to stand by as a partner and honor the work that is now happening here in the University of North Dakota. And for his understanding and his respect, I will be forever grateful, because he truly understood what this will mean to my relatives and to my family members, not only across North Dakota, but across the nation, as this news became public. And I will say that as terrible as this news has been, and how insensitive and inexcusable the treatment of our ancestors has been historically in the name of science, because that's what this boils down to. That's always the excuse. And then I'll say this as a Native man, as Nathan Davis. Science can no longer be an excuse from preventing our ancestors from returning home. I would personally like to commend President Armacost for his leadership in these hard times. He could have tried to sweep this under the rug, but he stood up and accepted full responsibility for what is now happening here at the University of North Dakota. And I will take it one step further and say, what truly meant the world to me is that he brought in Native American staff and Native American faculty to lead these efforts. He understood that this was not his area. He understood the need for respect, for understanding, for cultural appropriateness, to make sure that tribes were not an afterthought in this process, as historically we have been. And so to him and to his team, I say miigwech. The work that happens here will honor our ancestors. And that's our duty, to honor them. No matter how hard this is, how much it hurts, how confused we are, how angry we are, we have to stand up and we have to honor our ancestors and make sure that they return home. And I will say we have a very unique opportunity to honor them by changing the way that not only North Dakota, but the United States itself approaches repatriation. Because we all know that sadly, this work is far from over. And to all of you that have experience with this, you'll know what I'm saying. And one of the hardest issues of this now, just speaking personally, is one of the follow-up meetings that I had to facilitate was with a group of individuals that I consider my mentors, people that I grew up around. I was a very young elected tribal leader. So I sat around with these great men in many meetings around many tables. And I learned from each one of them individually how they approach the situation, their speaking style, their demeanor. I took pieces of each of them as I grew around them and kind of molded into my own style. And I will say that without warning, I brought this to their table. And we say in our culture, we begin every meeting in a good way, a good heart, because not a lot of meetings are easy, but we make sure that there's humor, and we make sure that we come away with a mutual understanding. But that day was probably one of the hardest days I've ever had in my professional career, is seeing the look on the faces of the men that I admire, the men that I look up to, my leaders, my relatives, as they were hurt and they were confused. And they have a running joke now that was the first time I ever came to see them that I didn't try to stick around for lunch. So if they're listening, they'll understand that joke. And as we begin the process of speaking with Indigenous staff and faculty, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of anger as well. And we know that there's going to be insensitivity. There's going to be some hurtful opinions that surface due to this news being released. And to all Native Americans, I will say, no matter how hard things get, now is not the time to hide who we are. Today is not that day. Yesterday was not that day, nor will tomorrow be that day. We have to stand up, and we have to do what's right by our ancestors. We have to rely on our culture and our teachings to carry us through these hard times. And with that, I say, miigwech.
With our remaining time today, we will open the floor to media questions of the panel. If you have a question for our panelists, go ahead and use the raise hand function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I can call on you and unmute your mic so you can ask your question and any follow-ups you might have. We have reserved this time for members of our media. So if you are a non-media member of our audience, we appreciate your attendance, but respectfully ask if you can yield the Q&A session to members of the media. To the members of the media, if you would please state your name and news outlet that you represent, and then ask your question, that would be great. With that, the Q&A session will begin momentarily. Okay, our first question today is from Neil Carlson. Neil, go ahead and ask your question.
All right, can you hear me?
I think you might be muted, Neil.
All right, can you hear me now?
All right, we're going to move on next to Sydney Mook of the Grand Forks Herald. Sydney, go ahead and ask your question.
And one, curious, where these sacred items and ancestors were found. Are we able to say, what building and what department would have been in charge of them? Kind of, who would have been responsible for overseeing them?
Well, as far as specific locations, we prefer not to release the details of where on campus they were or where they are currently. There were multiple locations, and through the support of tribal representatives, recently in August, we moved the ancestors and the sacred items to a single location on the campus. But in the interest of keeping that work private, I think it's important not to talk about the details of those locations. As to the question, I think that was implied by who was responsible. Ultimately, I'm responsible. Part of the work, as I mentioned earlier, is tracing what happened and how we would make such a discovery almost in plain sight of these sacred artifacts and ancestors. And so our immediate goal is to repatriate the ancestors and sacred items to the tribal nations as soon as possible. I'll call it a second order area that we're looking at is the lineage of responsibility and how did this happen? And that will require significant conversations with people involved in this work and carefully looking at archived records to piece together that puzzle. But what I can do is offer my assurance that now that these items are in our control and we know them to be in our control, we will take full responsibility for making sure repatriation happens as quickly as possible.
We're now going to move to a question from